guys, welcome back to another episode of Versus. My name is Midnight Strike, and today we're going to be talking about the Thunder from Down Under, ACDC, in a comparison video between Bon Scott and Brian Johnson, their two singers. And actually, I'm a huge ACDC fan, not as huge as I used to be, but nevertheless, I am very happy to be talking about this today, because you guys, you fans, voted for this. So, here it is. Bon Scott versus Brian Johnson. Actually, ACDC formed in 1973 with not Bon Scott, not Brian Johnson, but a third singer, a third vocalist with a more glamorous hue, Dave Evans. And they kicked him out for his pretty boy image, and he really wasn't fitting or cohesive within the band itself. And it was sort of falling from underneath all the weight around them. So they only produced two songs with him, Can I Sit Next to You Girl and Rockin' in the Parlor. Both of which I mean, he's got a good vocal. He's got a good voice. I'll give him that. He's got an excellent voice. Just not for AC/DC. I don't know what he sounds like now, but back then in the 70s, he sounded too cliche. It sounded like what everyone else was doing, and they didn't really have their hard rock image. They sounded more like a bubblegum popish kind of thing. And if you want to know what I mean, check out the music video for Can I Sit Next to You Girl. It's still up on YouTube, and it's still the official video for it, even though they re-recorded it in 1975 with Bon Scott on their second album, I believe, TNT. Either that or it was on the international release of High Voltage along with their Australian release, released a year earlier. So I'm not exactly sure on the release years, but I do know that they re-recorded both of them, and Dave Evans has not been on an official AC/DC release at all. He's just been basically like a live vocalist back in the day, and then they hired Bon Scott in 1974, I believe. He was from a band called the Valentines and then Fraternity. He was a drummer for a little while. He actually signed on to be AC/DC's drummer at first, but then they said, oh, no, we don't need a drummer. We need a vocalist. Are you good at singing? Pretty much. And he wanted to be their drummer still, but then he said, oh, well, why not? And then he tried out for the vocalist, and he excelled, he passed, he aced with flying colors, and they produced very stellar albums that weren't recognized by critics until much later. High Voltage and Let There Be Rock, Powerage, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, which was released in '76 in Australia, but was held off until 1981, actually, really long time, in the United States. So, basically, a lot of underrated gems that weren't really discovered until after Bon Scott passed. And that was due to an alcohol-related incident in 1980. I believe it was February 1980. So rest in peace, Bon Scott. You were a legend. You were just a true legend. But before he passed, he produced the masterpiece album that is Highway to Hell. I actually reviewed it on my channel here. So, fix the camera. So, Highway to Hell, instant classic. It's got Highway to Hell, you know, the title track, Walk All Over You, If You Want Blood, You've Got It. All those are just instantaneously recognizable as AC/DC and their trademark. So, much like their next album with Brian Johnson, Back in Black, which has the title track, and You Shook Me All Night Long. Those two are instantly just AC/DC's trademark signature songs. So, well, those three with Highway to Hell in there. Maybe TNT from their earlier release and Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. All those songs are just very well-known AC/DC songs. Very good. And just good old hard rock and raw thrash time. Not really thrash, sorry. But, just raw. Powerage is my favorite album, and that's from Bon Scott, the Bon Scott era. But it is vastly underrated compared to all their other material. Let There Be Rock was good, and Bon Scott has one live album called If You Want Blood, You've Got It. Brian Johnson has two called AC/DC Live and Live at River Plate. So, and the latter of which I had just received about a couple of weeks ago, actually, and I did a review of that as well on my channel. Also pointing out the fact that Bon Scott has a live album as well. Which one sounds better live? I would have to go with Bon Scott. Bon Scott is my favorite vocalist. My favorite living vocalist right now is Sebastian Bach, but overall I'd have to say Bon Scott because he's got a really hard just bluesy kind of tone that's just really soothing, but really rough at the same time. He can get that grit in his voice when he really needs to, and just scream like Brian Johnson. I mean, maybe he can't get that high shrill of a voice, that high shrill like screeching tone that Brian Johnson can get. That's just wonderful. He can't wail like Brian Johnson. No one can. But really, he does it in his own way. Bon Scott does it in his own way, and he still sounds amazing. And the reason why they chose Brian Johnson in the first place is because he was vastly different than Bon Scott, and they wanted to go just a harder rock vibe. So they did that, and then they released Back in Black, and that pretty much cemented themselves. That cemented the band in just hard rock fame for the rest of their lives, practically. They would forever be known for Back in Black and Highway to Hell. So those two back-to-back albums, 79 and 80, were just the flagship of hard rock. And then they released their 1981, For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, still an amazing album, an amazing effort by Brian Johnson, and it's just epic altogether epic. So, but you could hear his voice just start to waver a little bit, but it didn't really become evident until 83's Flick of the Switch, which was 2 years later, and he was really struggling to hit the high notes on that one. He still sounded just phenomenal, and he still had the same tone, the same pitch. He just struggled to hit the high notes, and his notes were getting grittier. His voice was getting raspy, and it just sounded like he was struggling to find his place. Few releases down the road, he sounds like he does now, and the Razor's Edge hits, and, well, they don't have their drummer anymore. They hadn't since Flick of the Switch at that point. But let me just tell you, the band still sounded in ship-shape, tip-top form on, bar Brian Johnson's voice, but he's aging, so, that's another thing. These guys are almost 60 to 70 years old, so, and they're still rocking out. They're still having a good time. Have they slowed down? Sure, but, who wouldn't at that age? Look at the Stones. So, anyways, ACDC were pretty much at the top of their game. Razor's Edge was their comeback album. It had hits like Thunderstruck and Money Talks. And then, a few years down the road, we have the return of Phil Rudd and Ballbreaker. And then 5 years later, Stiff Upper Lip. Those two kind of sound the same, and they're kind of I don't know. They're alright, but they're not my favorites, personally. And then a whopping 8 years later, they released Black Ice. Exclusive to Walmart. I have no idea why they did that, but they released Black Ice. And the guitar work on that album, phenomenal. Brian Johnson's vocals, pretty good. Better than the last two. The lyrics kind of sucked. But, other than that, good album. Solid album. So, Bon Scott era, be it Bon Scott era or Brian Johnson era, which you prefer, you gotta admit, both vocalists are just amazing. There are no words for it. Brian Johnson has been through a really tough, long journey with ACDC, and his voice has been through a lot. So it would be really vastly unfair to compare his vocals now to Bon Scott's vocals then. So Bon Scott in his prime, which is basically his entire career, and Brian Johnson in his prime, which was the start of ACDC. Which one do you guys think is better? I'm going to go with Bon Scott, but the entire point of the series is to generate a little bit of discussion here. So, be it Bon Scott, Brian Johnson, what do you guys think? Comment down below, subscribe if you like my videos. This is Midnight Strike 3625. Thanks for watching, keep calm, and rock on.